This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
10% of pediatric cancer is linked to a single gene variation. These variants can be detected in embryos before pregnancy begins. Orkin's whole genome reports can help mitigate your child's risk for cancer by screening for 90-plus genetic variants linked to pediatric cancer. Discuss embryo screening and IVF with a genetics expert. Hey everybody, welcome to this episode of Unsupervised Learning. And today I am here with Aria Babu. She is a researcher in England, and recently I saw a profile about pronatalism, and it was notable to me that Ms. Babu here is 27 years old, and there are some young people in the pronatal camp, but I was curious what a person of such an age was doing in, I guess I'm going to call it a movement now. The last time I did a podcast about pronatalism, I think it was like pretty exotic. Over the last year, in part due to the media, the gluttony for media attention of Malcolm and Simone Collins, who they're friends of mine, but they do like media attention. And so they have gotten some media attention. I would say most of it is actually kind of negative, but they don't care. And so the world knows a little about pronatalism. Aria, how do you know about it? Why do you care?
How do I know about it? So I think the first time it ever occurred to me to think about pronatalism was I was at sort of like an economics summer camp, and I just kind of repeated like the classic line that I think lots of people hear, that, oh, you know, the world is overpopulating. Maybe it would be a good thing if there were slightly fewer people. One of the other people there was like, actually, hold up. I think you'll find, so like the reason I said it was like basically like some mixture of beliefs about like the environment and resource usage, and maybe some idea about how if there are fewer people, wages might go up. And they basically were like, said to me, actually, in order to maintain this like modern economy, we need lots and lots of people in order to specialize. Like we need a constant inflow of people, which is why like immigrants are generally good for the economy. The environmental angle probably doesn't make much sense, considering that we actually expect to decarbonize and that like population growth is not very closely associated with increasing carbon usage. And yeah, that basically convinced me.
Yeah, I mean, some of these facts are actually pretty surprising. So, you know, as economies modernize, you know, they decarbonize. I think another issue is, so a couple of years ago, I had Ramez Naam on. He talked about solar power. Solar power in the 20th century, the late 20th century, when I was a youth, was one of those renewable resources that were the energy of the future. And then sometime after 2010, it really started taking off. A substantial minority of, electricity, energy is now coming from solar power. And it's competitive. There's also wind power and other things. Here in Texas, ideologically, the Republican Party is actually against renewables, but because development is so easy, we are actually generating more renewable energy than California, who ideologically support renewable energy, but they can't build anything there because of the building codes. Whatever. Environmental, ironically, a lot of it's the environmental review in California, which just takes forever and is frankly abused by property stakeholders to prevent development. Actually, a lot of people do not want wind farms, those big propellers, around their property, including, I think, RFK. I think the Kennedy family was really angry about that sort of development in Cape Cod. So there's a lot of NIMBY, not my backyard, going about that. Going back to the fertility, so a lot of large countries, obviously China, but I just recently checked Bangladesh's fertility, which is where I was born, just dropped below 2 in 2021. So it's around there. India also is around there. In some parts of India, including part of India in the south where your family's from, the fertility has been below 2 for a long time. And then it's finally actually dropping in Africa. It's still high, but it looks like the projections of, billions and billions, like many, many billions of Africans might be a little high. And the UN projections actually have routinely been overestimates because they have not taken into account the fertility transition. So, I mean, that's the empirical world that we live in. In the United States, up until I was about your age, we were pretty smug that we had maintained 2.1, that we were just naturally a very fertile developed country, and now we've dropped to 1.7, 1.6, like a European country. This started during 2008 to 2010. A lot of people thought it was because the financial crisis, but really it's just a new normal. And so here we are. We have pretty high immigration rates, although it's pretty uncontrolled, so that's going to be an issue. But so we're not in as bad of a straits as a lot of countries. Our average age is 34 as opposed to 47 or whatever in Italy. But these European countries, Italy's been 1.25 or whatever forever. South Korea obviously is disappearing. We know about that. So all of a sudden, I feel like there's been an inflection point, and over the last year, there's been a massive increase in public awareness of this issue. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, completely. I would caveat it by saying I think this is an increase in awareness in the Anglosphere, and we're actually just catching up to countries that are sort of further along the demographic transition, and that they've been talking about it for ages in Scandinavia and Japan, and we're just catching up with them.
Yeah, I saw a recent blog post. I think Japan's at 1.25, which is pretty low, but it was actually contrasting Japan with South Korea, because Japan's not going any further. Which is good, but 1.25 is still low. So you were talking about pronatalism and why we need it. Obviously, a lot of people don't internalize the fact that pensions, Social Security in the United States requires young people to pay for the old people that are now old. The math doesn't really work out currently with the way it's structured in I think a generation or so. It's a while, but still, at some point, the fund is going to start running into issues. But I think another thing that you pointed out, and maybe we should elaborate on it, is just regular pensions are just dependent on the economy. They're dependent on investments in the economy, and economic growth is dependent on productive working age people. And so if you have fewer and fewer productive working age people, you're going to have a contractionary situation, right?
Yeah. So I think the disaster scenario, which I'm not saying is the most likely scenario here, is that the world ages to the point where the average person is not even just not a child or anything, but the average person is outside of their possible fertility window. And at that point, the economy starts to shrink because we haven't managed to unlock any new major productivity enhancing technology. We then see the population is decreasing exponentially, not linearly, and as a result, we end up with economic growth dropping off very, very quickly, and we're at a point where we don't even have very many fertile people who can turn this around. Entire economies shrink pretty quickly. Lots of people withdraw all their money from the stock market. Lots of governments collapse. Basically, Detroit happens, but it happens to basically every rich country in the world, and this all happens in a very, very quick process after we are unable to do anything about it. I think that's the absolute worst case scenario of what happens.
Yeah, I mean, also children of men, kind of situation where probably the only societies that will maintain any semblance of order have to be very authoritarian, because
And they'll be probably the most disconnected from the modern world as well. We're thinking about the groups of people who are able to maintain high fertility. We're largely thinking about people who are very, very poor, or people who are very religious and cut themselves off from the modern countries that they're in. We think about the Amish and Orthodox Jews and stuff.
Yeah, the interesting thing is I looked at an analysis of the Amish. I think Lyman Stone did it, if I recall correctly, and their fertility is considerably higher than the average, but they also track the fertility of the general population. So during the baby boom, it was way higher than it is now. But right now, it's still higher than it was during the baby boom. Mormons, Latter-day Saints, have undergone a major fertility transition, and they're at TFR of 2.8, which is still high. But, when I was growing up in Eastern Oregon, I would run into people in the 1990s where they had 7 siblings, and it wasn't that exceptional. So they've undergone a major cultural transition over the last generation. I think part of it is because it's not like part of the podcast, so I'm not going to go into it in detail. But I've talked to multiple Mormon friends. A lot of Mormons don't believe in their religion anymore because of the internet. So I mean, they maintain like the cultural folk ways. They go to church, but once you lack the ideological commitment to producing bodies for new souls or for pre-existent souls, which is what they're doing, I think the fertility starts dropping. Partly because opportunity costs, obviously middle class people, women, the labor market, and so tell me what you think about what's driving this in your generation. I'll tell you actually what I always read in the media, which means that they have these stock phrases or stock people they want to talk to. It's usually, not always, but usually a young woman. And she always says, well, I want to travel and I want to focus on my career. And it's just like, okay, but like people have traveled and had careers forever. Like, why are careers and traveling so important now? I don't know.
So I think it would be a mistake to say there's one sole reason. I think it's kind of like asking, why does the economy grow or something like that, where you obviously have loads and loads of possible answers. I think if I were to like pick up on one thing that I think is one of the biggest driving forces is I think it's about what people predict they need to invest in their child to give that child a good life. So I think this is potentially why East Asia has such low birth rates, because in like Korea and Japan and stuff, I think parents rationally decide to have one child and then hyper invest in that child because like exams really matter, after school cramming really matters, clubs and societies really matter. In the US, we've seen that the amount of time middle class parents spend with their kids has gone up. The amount that they spend on after school hobbies and like things that can fill out a CV and get you into the Ivy Leagues, all of that stuff has become much more time intensive. So I think people are making what seems on the surface of it quite a rational choice to basically not have a second or third child because they think it will decrease their already existing child's life outcomes. This isn't the only cause, but I think it's like one driving force that explains why as populations get more educated and as economies develop, people don't seem to spend that extra money on having more children.
Although it's not just the educated segments in the United States, at least, and as you said, there's a lot of different causes, so this is not going to apply in East Asia. The drop is mostly attributable, apparently, to teens, like teen mothers, their fertility drop, which, in the 1990s, the 20th century, we would say it's a good thing, but now we're having issues with replacement. What do you think? Because it's not just affecting, Koreans who are like basically reductio ad absurdum, they're at one end of the extreme, overinvestment, quote unquote, overinvestment into, education and all these other value added things, which are, I do have to say, like, parenthetically, I know a fair number of Korean Americans that grew up in Korea, the ones that are kind of like average intelligence, they really are anti-intellectual because, their parents were just like, you're going to be a doctor. And they tried really hard and they like didn't have a life. And now they're managing a hotel and they really resent the fact that their whole youth was spent trying to do something that they probably were just like never cut out to do, But anyway, setting that aside, unhappiness of children that this is causing. Fertility is also dropping in like many, many less educated places and, among lower socioeconomic strata, right?
Yeah. So I think that's like a different reason for something that's going on. So I think if you look at the US, UK cases, and this is like true-ish in Europe, but I don't know the data as much, you find that lots of working class people are now just not getting married at all. Some of them, like often, they're still having like 1 or 2 children. I think this actually explains part of the reason why like European birth rates are higher than like Japanese birth rates, because in wedlock childbirths are about the same in Japan and Europe, but out of wedlock births are much, much, much higher in Europe and America. So I think potentially what's going on is there's like just a dearth of marriageable young men. Like unemployment seems to have hit men in these countries like more than it's hit women. Women are like much more likely to get educated. They're much more likely to get professional managerial jobs. Even at like the working class end of it, they're still more likely to be in employment because we've seen a decline of manufacturing labor and stuff. So these women are sometimes thinking, maybe I'll still have a child. And there are lots of, if you can read lots of case studies about like women who choose children over marriage, and they think that that's like a direct choice to make. But when you're in that situation, you probably can't afford to have as many children because you do not have a reliable man who can like pay for them, basically, and it's so much more work. So I think that's potentially also what's going on, that men aren't providing the economic resource that they used to be able to.
Yeah. I find it very. I mean, again, like the media, a lot of times they have a narrative and they have kind of a script. So that might be why this is happening. But I just find it very interesting that, in China, in Korea, in the US, when they interview young people who aren't going to have children, it's the women. I think partly it's they're articulate. I think a lot of the young men would not be very articulate. They would not be. I know I would not be giving good quotes at 25. Just.
My personal hunch also is that men have way less of a say over this anyway. So sure, you could get an answer from a whole bunch of men about why they don't currently have children, but just from like talking to people, I think in like most relationships, women are largely the driving force of deciding like whether or not they get married, whether or not they have kids, and are just like thinking much more about their relationship to begin with.
Yeah, I think the men who I know, and obviously I'm older than you, I know guys who just didn't want kids. I'm actually gonna qualify that in a second. I know men who didn't want kids from like when we were in our early to mid 20s, like people I went to college with and early in the workforce. And the reasons that they usually gave was just like, oh well, I don't think I could I think I'm just too selfish and I couldn't focus on somebody else. That's not really a quote that I don't think a lot of newspapers, you know what I'm saying? It's not like really a positive, productive reason, but they're very candid. They're like, I like to go to Germany and drink beer. It's like a literal quote from a friend of mine. He's like, can I do that? And another friend, he doesn't listen to the podcast, so I can just say it. He's like, I don't like looking at babies. They look like slugs, like they don't give like very elevated reasons. So I think that's part of it. I do have to say, I wouldn't say many, but I know multiple people, both male and female, who change their mind. Usually in their mid-30s, with men somewhat later. The issue here, though, is the result is usually different for men and women, where a much higher number of the men end up marrying someone and having children. And the women, a minority of them, the fertility treatments work, but I have to say a large number of them, it's actually it's a big, it's like a multi, I don't want to I have friends who've been through this for 4 years, and candidly, it doesn't look like there's going to be a biological child light at the end of the tunnel. And so I think that's like two different trajectories that I've noticed, where many people that I've known over the last 20 years have changed their mind. But a lot of the men, they're like, oh, okay, I'll find someone young-ish, And with the women, it's like, well, that's not an option. They got to find who they got to find, and they got to like accelerate. And so I think that's an interesting or sad contrast.
Yeah, that makes sense. I would really like it if egg freezing were just a normal thing that people did, especially because like even if you don't end up using your frozen eggs, you can then give them to other people who are struggling with fertility. It's not even that expensive. People say it's expensive, but it's only about £5,000 in the UK. I don't know what that is in US money, but that's like hardly anything compared to a whole bunch of other kinds of savings and investments people make. Plus, you can make like 60k off them.
Yeah. Which, I know people we both know people who know all the numbers and stuff like that. It's a burgeoning like, part of the economy. I mean, not a big part, but it's beginning. I know many people in Silicon Valley that have frozen eggs, frozen embryos. And then there's all sorts of ethical issues related to that when the relationships end, but, people are hedging their bets, engaging in optionality. So there's a lot of options now, I guess. So like let's talk about technology. What do you think? I mean, so Israel has an above replacement. In fact, Israel has above replacement among secular Israeli Jews, or at least around replacement, which is magical, supposedly. But they also are very, very aggressive in subsidization of in vitro and all these assisted reproductive technologies. Do you think on the margin that will make a difference?
Yeah, I think on the margin, it probably makes a difference. What I like about subsidizing these technologies is instead of it being something like cash handouts for babies, which are very, very expensive government policies, it is you're only really paying for marginal extra children. when you do fertility. So I think it's like reasonably savvy government spending as well if you want to do a pronatalist government policy. This is why I talk about egg freezing, where it seems like these technologies are much more effective if you proactively decide that you want to use them when you're younger and more fertile. But if you have basically egg freezing combined with like free IVF, I think you could probably get like an extra couple of points to your TFR.
Yeah, and like in Europe, that's not very controversial most of the continent, right?
No, I don't think so. I mean, free IVF on the NHS is not controversial at all. Sometimes I see like Guardian scare articles about how disgusting it is that tech companies offer people like free egg freezing, but I suspect most people don't care.
Yeah, I mean, that's just class envy, whatever, just the usual, because in the United States, in vitro is not really controversial, but I think the issue would be, because I know different states have different mandates to insurance. I think the issue would be there would be a lot of localities where people would say that they don't want that to be subsidized for ethical reasons, because some people have a minority of the population, which is not trivial, has an ethical objection to that. So I think in the United States, that would be a patchwork solution. Can you talk about like what's going on in France? Like I'm just like I looked at a map of fertility. So one thing that people often say about France, and I think that's not true, but is France has a very high fertility because it's got a massive immigrant population. Like what do you say about this sort of stuff?
So France doesn't record any race-based data, as far as I'm aware. I think it's one of those principles that they take very strongly. I think they also don't record religious data. It's got something to do with Enlightenment principles in the French Revolution or something. So we can't pick out the details. I would say, though, based on other numbers I know about France, I would expect the white French population to also be having more children than other similar Europeans. A couple of stuff is that French people move out of their houses and live independently way younger than other continental Europeans, which indicates to me that they are, and their housing's quite cheap. So which indicates to me that they are actually forming like relationships and family units and couples, probably younger than like Italians and stuff. Also, French don't spend very much time with their kids, which is also like reasonably predictive of having more children. And then France has like loads of really, really like aggressive subsidies towards parents. So like their childcare is very cheap. It's not like super high quality, but it is very cheap. And also like there are loads and loads of tax benefits that you suddenly accrue if you have children. So I wouldn't be surprised if like the white French population also has a high birth rate compared to other white Europeans.
Yeah. So the way you would do it is, so I've actually like thought about this, and like this would take time. They do record the number of births with sickle cell gene.
Interesting. Yes.
So you could create a model. You could create a model that could back infer the various. I mean, basically, the issue is sickle cell carrying rates are very low among zero among Northern Europeans, right? And so you can like back infer from that. You could look at the base rate in Africa and stuff like that. Like maybe I should just do it, but because they just recently started a couple of years ago, they recently started collecting it on all births, whereas before you had to have like at least one, immigrant or like one ethnic. One of the parents had to be from an ethnic group where it was a risk, and so only a minority were recorded, but now they're all recorded. And so also like by the way, France is really weird about genetic testing. Like you have to have like stuff delivered to Belgium and then you go get it and stuff like that.
Do you know why that is?
It's the paternity thing.
Yeah they don't want to dissolve marriages because I guess they all just accept that they're cheating on each other.
Yeah, but I think the issue is like like in most of the data it shows that like like most of the time like the father is the father in like strong marriages, and I think what that must just indicate partly is people aren't stupid about timing and protection, and you know what I'm saying? They're probably like way more vigilant when they're. I mean, I don't know for a fact, but I suspect looking at the numbers, because the numbers are like Western European countries are like they're close to 1%. They're about 1%. They're not very high. They get much higher in lower socioeconomic strata, or like the higher numbers are in lower socioeconomic strata where basically a lot of times the fathers don't live near, and it's just like he might be like a migrant or migrating for work and all these other issues. So I think our intuitions are a little off because of tabloid journalism. Also, the original genetic data that talked about paternity was from paternity clinics that had a massive like ascertainment bias in terms of who was,
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So like 10 to 30% or whatever were coming back as not the father, but like the guys that were like sending those in are not the typical guy, So I'm curious. You're like now like was it New Statesman or something? What were you in? Was it the Times?
It was the
the
Times? Yeah.
Yeah. So what do people? I mean, do people think in your age group in England? Do people think you're kind of crazy or weird?
I actually don't know. I've shielded myself off from like having lots of friends who would think it was strange to be interested in like pronatalism or something. I'm thinking like my school friends as a group, I definitely think they think I'm strange, but probably not like for this. I think it's more like having a strong ideological commitment to any idea would be strange, and this is just one of many ideas I could have and have chosen over time.
I got it. So your pronatalism is actually emergent out of your just like generally like heterodox ideological tendencies overall.
Yeah, like I'm definitely like, I've been like very into, like I am still like reasonably into effective altruism, so I've like talked to them a lot about AI safety, I've talked to them a lot about like libertarianism, I've been angry about like loads of different things different governments do, so this just kind of fits very neatly, I think, to most people in like the package of the kind of thing I would care about.
Okay, and for the pro-natalist movement, so I spoke at Natal last year, and it was like a pretty diverse bunch. There's like some trad cats, Mormons, kind of like ethno-nationalist type people. Then there was like I think people more like you or me that are more into like okay, like we're talking about in vitro and all these other things and technology and embryo screening. And so, what is it like in England? What is the scene like in England? Because you're not a very religious country compared to the U.S.
Yeah, I guess in England there's probably, I think, well, of the people I know, I guess I would split it into two camps, where you have people who are like basically like tech focused, interested in this, would probably be interested in anything that they thought would boost the economy, that package of people. And then I also think there's a group of people that I guess socially conservative women, like there's a whole package of beliefs that this goes with, where like they're usually anti-porn, anti-sex work, anti-trans, and also pronatalists, where I would kind of consider
why don't you just say Louise Perry? Just joking, but
well, like she's obviously one of them, but she's not like she is like I think representative of like a reasonably actual like large cluster of people. As in I don't want to, but like I could name like actual politicians who are part of this camp.
Okay.
And I guess I would like describe like the two different views as being like, I think people who are like pronatalists first, and if like you found out that like surrogacy would be like the actual thing that like boosted birth rates, would be like very comfortable doing that, and a package of beliefs that I actually think are more like pro-women policies. And I think pronatalism is part of the set of things that they think are in women's interests, but are like actually more primarily a kind of like conservative feminist.
So that's the landscape in Britain. One thing that I'm curious about, and I want to get your take, is I remember like in France in 2007, the socialist party leader, the prime minister candidate who lost to Macron, Ségolène Royal, had 4 kids. And I think her partner at the time was Francois Hollande, who later became president, actually. And so it's like he had 4 children, and he's a socialist. Unless you're a Kennedy, if you're a Democratic politician in the U.S., that to me would be like really rare. It's the elite signaling is, I think, a big deal, and it seems like in France, like obviously Macron has no children, and I think like this is not a pattern that's held, but it was notable to me that, there are elite people in France that have a lot of kids. Anyway, I saw some data on Twitter that showed like in South Korea, billionaires have fewer children than they do in France and Germany.
Yeah.
So, elite cultural signals matter. In the US, there is, if at like very, very high wealth, like 0.1% or something, or 1%, the fertility starts to go up again. Like really the fertility crunch is like lower upper middle class or something, maybe at the like 10th percent or something like that, 20th percent, like reaching for the IVs. But there's not that many people at those higher thresholds. On the other hand, so they don't have an effect on the bottom line of the TFR. On the other hand, like, if I feel like if movie stars and other people start just having a lot of kids, I think that would have a cultural impact. What do you say about that?
So I kind of agree and disagree at the same time. I kind of think there are like two different ways to be like an elite rich person in the UK. I think there are like some, like, if you're thinking about like these sort of educated, want to send their kids to Oxbridge, live in London group of people, I think you would basically need other educated people to be seen as the kind of celebrities who have lots of kids. So like, I don't think they have very many sort of like, I guess, quote unquote, role models of that kind. I think if you're then thinking about the kind of role models that more working class people have, I think they do have a lot of kids. So I'm thinking like Love Island stars, footballers. These are people who, when they achieve wealth, they do seem to translate into having lots of children. And also those people probably have it easier to have more children because they're in places where childcare is cheaper. They're in places where housing is cheaper. They're probably actually, in terms of like disposable income, richer. I think if you want to incentivize them to have kids, they've already got the royals, they've got their potential role models. I'm not sure I can think of any group of people who would have a lot of kids who could inspire the sort of like metropolitan liberal elites to do it. I think you would need like I don't know, some kind of professor, some kind of like left-wing politician or something.
Okay. Well, Love Island. I think Chris Williamson was on Love Island, right?
He was, yeah.
Yeah. I see him around Austin. I don't think he has any kids, but
Does he not? He definitely talks about pronatalism.
Yeah. He's pretty based, but no, I'm not gonna talk about his personal life because that's weird. But he doesn't. I mean, unless he doesn't invest any time with them, he doesn't have any kids. So anyway, okay. So I never like looked up what Love Island is, but it's like it is what you describe it, right?
It's like a TV show where hot but not very smart people. I've never actually watched it, so this is my summary from what other people seem to say. It's where hot but not very bright people are put on an island, and they're not allowed like any outside contact, and they all have to couple up, basically. Yeah,
I mean, okay, like that's definitely a recipe for quote love. So that makes sense. They're not going to be developing a new theory of physics.
Yeah, well, apparently they're not allowed. There's like a whole bunch of topics that they're not allowed to talk about. So like they often get cut to look more vapid than they actually are.
To accentuate their. Okay, I got it. It's a whole brand, and it makes it easier editing. So I want to pivot to like England a little bit. So I'm just gonna say I'm gonna post this after the election, but we were recording before the election. But there's pretty much no doubt that the Conservatives are gonna get hosed. So I think like if the Conservatives don't get hosed, whatever. I'm just gonna like edit this part of the podcast out. But I'm pretty sure. I mean, there's certain things in politics you could not be super sure about, but there's just like no way that they're not going to get screwed,
Yeah. Despite like, even if you forgot their personal failings, like the high inflation, low wage growth environment just means that they're obviously not going to win this.
Well, also, I mean, they've been in power for 14 years. It's just, people get tired of parties. Like Labour was in power for 13 years before the Conservatives took over. People get tired. So like, you got to make a really strong proactive case. They really haven't. I don't want to like dump on England, but like, the last couple of years, I've already said this in a couple of podcasts, and I think that they will be posted before. So I have this idea, and I'm just going to like say this to see what you think. Okay. So, you guys speak English. You have some cultural similarities. Why don't we just turn the UK into a protectorate? You don't need an army or a navy or all this stuff. You guys always just do what we say anyway, So it's like there's really no point in having an independent military. You can keep your NHS, like keep your parliament or whatever, but you guys can be guest workers in the United States and make a lot more money, And you speak English already. There's like no issue with like language barriers. There's a lot of good gardeners in England, and there's a lot of gardening that needs to be done in the United States. So I think it would be like a good move. Like you guys aren't in the EU anymore, and it was always like difficult because like you don't want to learn German. Like, English speakers do not like learning other languages. That's just a fact. And so the whole mobility thing was a little bit fake, although obviously you could speak English in these other European countries too, especially the Nordic countries. But I think it would be I think it would be win-win. Also, like England could get over its pretension that it's some sort of power. It's just like that's over. Like the economy is smaller than India's now, you know. And I think at an individual scale, I think it would unleash a lot of productivity. I think a lot of younger British people are already coming to the United States, and it would just like bring the rest of them over. In the United States, we have a big internal market, obviously, and the best and the brightest go to places like Silicon Valley already, and so like why not? I think that this would be a good opportunity. And I don't see like the big downside except for like national pride, which is a big deal. I know pride is a big deal. People are stubborn, but I think it would make sense. And I think like, it would get you guys out of the doldrums, integrating with like a vast market where you speak the same language and you have cultural similarities, but that's just my opinion.
I prefer a kind of Singapore on Thames model that we were promised with Brexit. Like, I think why attach ourselves to the US's FDA and occupational licensing schemes, and why attach ourselves to the European versions of those? Why not try and do like some really solid like regulatory arbitrage between those two? There aren't many countries that have that, like 60 million people.
Yeah, well, what I'm proposing is you guys can keep like keep your domestic affairs fine. I just want British guest workers.
Oh yeah, honestly, I mean, I already remotely work for an American company, and I'm very happy with the arbitrage that provides me for my lifestyle.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's and like I know people already outsourcing to the UK for low wage labor in tech, so you're probably part of it. I mean, comparatively, you're affordable. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
There's been a massive gap that's opened up since 2008, and it's just really weird because when I was growing up, the gap, it was volatile, and you guys had like caught up, right before the financial crisis because finance was such a big deal. But it's starting to get a little ridiculous. I have friends in tech, and like they look at like the engineer salaries in London, and they're like, oh, like we should just like have a branch office. The main issue is the distance and whatever. Like remote is always an issue, but it's really weird because you guys speak English. You're not like that much less educated or whatever. You have Oxford and Cambridge. You actually have pretty good higher educational institutions. So like what's going on in your country? Like I don't know like what's happening.
I think I genuinely I think a whole bunch of this is that we just don't build stuff. We're so unbelievably stuck in the Southeast is like our most economically productive areas. Our housing is so much more expensive, as far as I can tell, than everywhere in the US, despite the fact that our wages are much lower. Our office space is more expensive. Our energy is our energy is 3 times more expensive. I think one of my friends had this line that we basically got the wages of Mississippi, the rent of Manhattan, and the like energy costs of, I guess, like nowhere in the US is energy costs this high. As a result, we can't build anything. I also think there is like some extent to which we are like also a very bureaucratic nation. But I feel like when I hear like people talk about problems in the US, it doesn't feel like it's that much more extreme.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the same issues, are like all Anglosphere, I mean, the thing with the US that I love, is we are a big country and there's diversity. So in Texas, where I live, in Austin, the rents have been dropping. Which when I tell my friends in the Bay Area that, they just like look at me very confused. Like that's against the laws of nature, but it's because it's just because there's like a lot of building here. And why is there a lot of building here? It's because like the state of Texas has a pre-existing culture. It's like it's contingent lock-in. It's not because like, conservative, libertarian, ideological people are like overwhelming majority. They're not. There's actually like, there's plenty of stuff in the news about people in Texas. They don't want this being built and that being built, but the laws and the pre-existent culture are such that, well, they've never cared and they've allowed them to build, and so there's an inertia. And so it's never been a situation where they haven't built. A lot of this stuff is not like pretty. It's not. We don't look like San Francisco. Austin doesn't look like San Francisco. It's not that aesthetically pleasing. But it's way cheaper, and that's why we're getting a lot of the refugees from San Francisco. I do think. So I did record a podcast. And it'll post before this one, so listeners will get a chance to listen to it with my friend Leighton Woodhouse, who lives in Oakland. I do think the Bay Area is. I mean, if you look at the VC investment and stuff like that, and like how many intelligent people are there, it's actually like pretty horrible that its governance is so bad. with like the low level, property crime and the rents and everything like that. And so that's squandering some of our human capital
I think
into just hustling.
the world has probably lost so much in terms of like possible like economic growth and innovation from the fact that San Francisco is now such an awful place to live.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically like it's an equilibrium state. Like they have all these for every unicorn that emerges out of San Francisco, the governance is going to get like equivalently worse because the tax base is going to get bigger, and they're going to have like all these like rich, or really well off. Like if you're like a 29-year-old engineer making $350,000, you have a lot of disposable income, no matter what the tax rate is, and so it's a wash in money, and they're not, until very recently they haven't voted these people out. It is changing. They're going to probably swing back towards moderate Democrats. The model that I will tell you is like, I know Singapore is great, but New York City during the Bloomberg era was like professional managerial class heaven. Because Bloomberg, he was socially liberal enough that people would vote for him in the city, but he knew how to keep order. The crime rate was low. The public disorder was low. Giuliani obviously started it. There was like a decline in crime earlier, but really like the Bloomberg period, like New York was like a paradise for middle to upper middle class professionals. And I think that's kind of a little bit the model. Even then though, obviously New York has issues with rent control and all these other things. So, we have governance issues. But the thing with England is like, it's like an American, it's like California. It's more populous than California. You guys have 65 million people.
Yeah. I think we basically got the population of like a whole, basically the Eastern Seaboard, right?
Yeah, that sounds right. And so, but you also have high immigration rates. I was looking at like 40% of the people showed up since 2010. What? That's a lot.
That's
immigrants.
I think there's an extent to which that's like a little bit of a fluke in that we took loads of Hong Kong refugees, loads of Ukrainian refugees. So I wouldn't expect our immigration rate to stay as high as it has been just sort of like during this like quick period. That being said, as far as I can tell, a couple of like structural factors for some reason means that post-Brexit that we have also higher immigration in general. I think it's because we're granting more asylum places and also more like working visas because we need more nurses, we need more care workers, we need more farm laborers.
Yeah, I mean, that was I was talking to a friend of mine about, there's a lot of people that have like one child or no children, and you hit a certain age and you start to be like Joe Biden, and you need young people to help you, and well, who are those young people going to be? I think it's going to be, I think they're called Filipinos,
For us, I think we've got lots of Europeans who still want to move here as well. And I've definitely noticed that the service in UK restaurants has gotten a lot better since we've started to have, as far as I can tell, way more Indian migration as well. Like
directly from India.
Yeah. Like, I've definitely noticed that like my waitresses are getting more and more Indian over these past few years and more polite.
Well, what's up with so just like for the listener who doesn't know the breakdown, the Asian quote population of the UK, like there's a lot of Pakistanis, they're from the Mirpur region, a lot of Bangladeshis, mostly from Sylhet, and then of the Indian population, a lot of it is actually from East Africa. So, and then like a lot of those are also, the others are mostly, a lot of them are Sikh Punjabis. So the typical quote unquote Indian is actually a small minority, or not a small minority, but it's a minority among the the established South Asian population, right? Yeah. And so are you getting an influx more of the Indians, so to speak?
That is, as far as I can tell. I don't have your skills of being able to like completely identify, but their accents seem Indian and they like seem Indian to me.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. The weird thing about, by the way, when I went to Europe like 15 years ago, or it was 2010, so 14 years ago, the Bengalis in Florence, I can understand their Bengali because they speak standard Bengali, mostly. The Bengalis in London, I had no idea what the hell they were talking about on the street because they're speaking Sylheti.
Interesting.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, like the London Bengalis, the Bengalis when they speak Bengali on the street, that's a dialect. It would be like saying Sicilian is Italian. It's not. Yeah. It's not intelligible. So it's just like, that's just like a weird fact. Because like I've heard I just I kind of knew about it, but I saw something on YouTube once where it was like a British person speaking Bengali on the street, and I'm just like, what the fuck is that? It's like, and then like I looked at the comments and people are like, that's not Bengali, that's Sylheti, that's not Bengali, that's Sylheti, because I don't know if Sylheti is even a written language, but who cares? You guys aren't going to be like, they're not going to be writing it in the UK, so they just like continue speaking it as that. Some of the same thing happened in the United States, where some dialects continued and people would say it's Italian, but it turns out it's like Neapolitan dialect, which is quite distinct from standard Italian. But so you have these immigrants from all these different places, and that's causing, so you guys don't build and you're increasing your population through immigration. That seems like not a good thing.
Yeah, I guess.
Unless you're a landlord.
Unless you're a landlord. I guess I think we're still at the point where on net, working immigrants probably still basically benefit the economy on net, even though they'll drive rents up even higher. Ideally, obviously, we'll build a lot of housing and also be able to have lots of wonderful working age immigrants. But if we can't do that, I still think it's probably better to have a fair amount of immigration, considering our population pyramid.
Yeah, I mean, what's the difference between Scotland and the UK here, or England?
I have no idea.
Because I know, like, if you look at the ethnic breakdown in Scotland, it's way whiter, So kind of be like a laboratory, I think. I mean, until relatively recently, I think Northern Ireland had a relatively high fertility for the UK because of competitive fertility, basically between Catholics and Protestants, right? So it would have like a somewhat different dynamic. And I think the UK as a whole, it doesn't have like Southern European levels of fertility. It's got like Nordic levels of fertility, right?
Yeah, my guess is that there's some kind of baseline pronatal culture that we have basically in the Anglosphere as a whole that shields us from some of the incredibly low fertility that like Catholic Europe is experiencing.
Well, a lot of it is what you were alluding to in France, though, moving out.
Yes. Yeah. So I think boys, so A, they've got really high youth unemployment throughout lots and lots of Southern Europe. B, I think boys who don't have jobs just do not leave their parents' housing. And therefore, like, when are they meant to get a wife? When are they meant to find a girlfriend? How are they meant to get anyone pregnant?
Yeah, just the whole youth unemployment thing, like, people who've been to Southern Europe knows how it works. Like, basically, they don't have like they don't have like cradle to grave welfare socialism like the Nordic countries, but they have a regulatory state that basically if you get a job you can't be fired, and that means that they don't really like to hire people full time because they can't fire them. And then I know concretely from Italy, a lot of people, once they get a job, they think that's the jackpot and they work the least amount possible. And so like they have, real issues with just getting anything done, absenteeism, all these things. It's just really difficult because the laws protect them. And so they're just going to go to the edge of the law. And so there's like a lot of problems in those societies relating to that. Part-time workers, quote unquote, they'll work hard because they have to get productivity out of somewhere. But, and there's been a lot of scandals in Italy of like people that just never come to work, but still collect salaries somehow. Because, it's just a pain in the butt to like, actually, I know this in the United States in one context, universities. I do have a case where basically a woman in a laboratory was a technician and she had chronic depression and basically just stopped coming. And my other friend, who was the other technician, had to like pick up the slack. And basically the professor that was managing the laboratory was like, look, the way the laws work in University of California or in California with the regulations and stuff like that, with her funding and all this stuff, it would cost me more money and time to go through the paperwork to fire her than to just pay her for 6 months and just like let it lapse. And so he was trying to scramble for more money to like pay for my friend to give her a raise and all this stuff. And that's how I know about it. But, these are the sort of things that are inefficiencies that exist in the world. And, they cause all sorts of problems. Like ideally we don't have them. And, we talked about the housing issue. What do you think about density and fertility, going back to like, the topic of what we started out with? I have a friend, I think his name is More Births on Twitter. And he says that the high density is a serious problem, that anywhere you have high density, you have low fertility, which you guys live in a high density island, so.
I am like actually a bit doubtful of that data because I think people select into and out of high and low density. So I'm sort of like making plans. I'm going to get married later this year. I'm probably going to have a kid soonish. And I'm now planning on moving from like the very, very center of the city to the like not quite the suburbs, but like slightly further out to like a less dense place. It's not that the density is causing necessarily low fertility. It's that people who are not currently planning on having children select into high dense areas. So I'm just like kind of suspicious of that thesis overall. Also, we're not that dense of an island in that, like, I guess lots of people live in and around the southeast, but we've got loads and loads of space.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I pretty much actually do agree with you because, here in Austin, the way it works, I think, is compared to Silicon Valley or Bay Area where I lived before, is there you'd have a 3-bedroom house, like a single story house, a very simple middle class house. It's like $3 million, and some like manager at Google who's like pretty high up or whatever lives there, and regular people obviously are cramping into apartments and figuring out situations. Here in Austin, that manager will probably live in a really, really nice condominium if he lives in the city, or he or she, and if they want to, they'll live in like a really, really big quasi suburban place in the west of Austin, Westlake and something like that. And so there are options, and that actually like frees up housing for regular people in non apartments. So if you have like dense condos that are that are like moderately expensive but affordable for people in their 20s, that's fine. Because like some of the reason that like there's resentment against tech workers in SF is because you have these 25-year-old engineers that are making a lot of money, and like they're just gonna find apartments to live in, and they're gonna kick out the regular people who make like a third their salary, So I think if you do like give people supply, that will release pressure in all sorts of ways, and I think that's the underlying logic.
Oh yeah, completely. Like housing makes questions about economic growth, restrictive housing, I should say, make questions about economic growth and immigration like much more zero-sum than they, I guess, should be. I also think in London, at the very least, I think in lots of Britain, we have a tradition of like great mansion flats where you'll build like courtyards and like 6-8 story sets of flats where they're actually really spacious on the inside if you go to them. Plenty of room to have kids in, but we've basically made building like that illegal. So there are like also ways that you could continue to have like very dense London neighborhoods that probably were like conducive to families. It's just we don't let that happen for a whole bunch of silly reasons.
Yeah. Well, hopefully it will. So we've been talking for a while. I want to end up. So you said you're gonna have kids soon. You're 27. You got a lot of running room, so to speak. Like, do you have a target number?
I don't have a target number. I think I've got a couple of reasons for not having a target number. The big one being that I actually don't know what the experience of having children is like. And it could be that while I say that people are making what I consider to be like only a semi-rational decision about hyperinvestment in a child or whatever, I expect I will learn a lot from having the first child about how much investment I do think is like about correct. I also
how tall are you?
5'3".
Okay. It's like the correlation is not like super tight, but the taller you are, from what I have seen, and I've read this, Sarah Blaffer-Hurdy has some stuff about this. The larger a woman is, usually the easier the pregnancy is because it's just like a smaller proportion of her body,
Yeah, so this is actually one of my big concerns, which is that, as far as I can tell, all the babies born to women in my family have been very big and also cesarean babies. I am like quite small. My partner's quite big.
Yeah. So the size at birth, I actually know a little bit about this because my sister is whatever. Like, I'm not gonna like say any details about her, but I think people know I have a sister. So she's very small, smaller than you, and I would just say like her babies, like her daughter was. Okay, well, I just said I have a niece, but whatever. I don't think it'll matter 25 years from now when she becomes an adult that I just said I had a niece, because hopefully I'll still be alive. But still, she was 5 pounds 9 ounces, very small, and I'm not gonna get details. Her brother's very small. My kids were, was it like 8, 9, and 10 pounds. Obviously, we're related. So I was curious about this, and I asked a friend of mine who's worked on some of the genetics and the heritability of the genetic incompatibilities and all this stuff and the birth weight size. It's the mother that's determining it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's much more important what your size is or what your family's history is than your partner's, okay? Your husband's or whatever. So just so you know, because like my sister's husband he's like about 5'11", 6 foot, you know, normal size. I'm 5'8". I'm not like super tall, but I was 6'6". I think I was 6'6". I was 6'6". My siblings were like, I had a sibling who's like 6'9", and another who was like 6'3" and 7. So we were all small. My mom is not as small as my sister, but the point I'm telling you is like kind of a tangent, but it's news you can use. Look at what the maternal what the mothers, the babies, because they're the ones that are determining how much obviously nutrients and at what time they come out, right? And so they're doing like an evolutionary trade-off about their size and their immune system and all sorts of things. And so women will tend to give birth to about the same size based on what their maternal lineage is, irrespective of the father. Like obviously, so I was smaller. All my kids were born much closer to my wife's size. So
that's unfortunately not encouraging, considering that I think I was 7 ounces and I was taken out by cesarean from a mother who's like shorter than I am. So yeah,
I mean,
that is exactly the kind of thing that worries me, though.
Yeah, but you know the rate of cesarean does vary a lot by like in Brazil it's like what 50% or something. It's really high. That actually might have dropped Brazil's fertility a lot. Just a lot of listeners probably don't know this. They really do not recommend that you like do too many cesareans, so that's gonna cap. And like they also in the U.S. at least they don't recommend that you do vaginal birth after cesareans, although people do. So there's a whole like VBAC movement. Just anyway, when you have kids, like you learn all these things, you know. But yeah, so it puts a cap on it, and then that's just like a natural thing. I think I got above 2, so we'll see. That's above replacement, and I guess like that's practicing a little bit what I preach. But good luck on everything, and it's not really the individual outcome I think that matters, although it's good to model it. It's like do we have the social context to allow it, right?
Yeah, like I guess I care about the environment. I'm not the kind of environmentalist who diligently recycles and washes out the plastic and refuses to fly. I'm the kind of person who like will vote for like a carbon tax if that comes up. And that is like largely how I think about the fertility thing. Although I kind of, when you spend so much time thinking about people having babies, I do think it makes you want to have more.
Yeah. So, good luck on everything. I think we'll be hearing a lot from you. I do have to say, like many British people, you are very eloquent and you sound very bright. So I think you have a big future if you want to be a public intellectual in the United States, because you get an automatic bonus.
Yeah, I think the accent just automatically gives me like an assumed 10 extra IQ points. It's great.
Yeah, I do have British friends who tell me that like they don't like it when there's other British people around because it like reduces their uniqueness and value, and if they disagree, Americans don't know who to agree with, because they sound equally smart. So there's a whole cultural weirdness around that. But yeah, it was great talking to you. Good luck on everything. I think I think the future still holds promise. I know that there's a lot of pessimism, like the whole degrowth movement. I think your country is experimenting with that. But I think that's going to be a fad. I don't think we're going to go extinct. You don't need to have a rebellion. And, we at some point, we got to figure out this situation with shrinking populations, because they could shrink indefinitely, but eventually then everyone's going to become like Amish, Roma, a few like Hasidic Jew, and I don't know if that's going to work with the world's population,
Yeah. I described the like worst case scenario. I don't think that's likely. I think what's likely is we'll just be poorer and we'll have fewer like people to be happy and enjoy the earth than we would in the counterfactual.
Yeah. Well, that's a good place to end. Great having you on, Aria, and I will see you around.
Yeah, you too. Thanks for having me.
Even if you and your partner are healthy, there's still a chance your child can develop a serious genetic disease. This is because every embryo has new changes not present in either parent. Most of the time, these are benign, but sometimes they can be catastrophic. Orchid's whole genome embryo reports directly screen the embryo and analyze these de novo genetic mutations. Discuss embryo screening in IVF with a genetics expert.
This podcast for kids